move on here and talk about Afghanistan, where we now have another report from the New York Times on the ISIS K, the alleged ISIS K safe house that was the target of the, what was it, August 29th drone strike in Kabul that killed 10 civilians, including 7 children. We've covered it on the show from, I think, the day after it happened all the way up until now, and the military investigating itself and finding that it did nothing wrong. What it also can't find is the ISIS K safe house. Now, what it alleged is that Ahmadi, who is the U.S. aid worker, works for a U.S. aid company who the U.S. targeted with this strike. What they said, that the reason that they thought he was in the Islamic State is because he went to his boss's home, also works for a U.S. aid company, right? They're Afghans, but they work for American California-based aid companies, right? He goes to his house and picks up a laptop. That is what they say ties him to ISIS-K. Turns out his boss's house is in ISIS-K. His boss has no ties to ISIS-K whatsoever. Neither of these two men have any more ties to ISIS-K than any other Afghans who live in Kabul, and are far more tied to the U.S. government, right? Like, they work for U.S. aid agencies. So anyways, they see this, surveil him for the next 8 hours, and then kill him. Also, something in this New York Times article that's worth noting is actually 9 seconds before they launched the strike, there were 2 adults and 4 children. And they say that Amiri's cousin was clearly in the video. Cousin was in the video that this entire time. His name is Zamiri Ahmadi, and his cousin being in the video the entire time makes it so that, this strike didn't follow the regulations that was supposed to, of not guaranteeing civilian casualties. And it wasn't just, oh, we missed it. They knew they were there and launched a strike anyway, it seems, more and more. So this was an out-and-out murder. But anyways, they still, 2 months later, or whatever it is, 2.5 months later, they still can't find the ISIS safe house. And so it's hilarious that there are still, well, not hilarious, it's absolutely disgusting. But, it's comical that the U.S. government thinks that it could say it has intelligence, and that's how it targets people with drone strikes, and then can't even identify homes of U.S. aid workers as not ISIS-K hideouts, and they can't even find the real one. So, what a joke the U.S. military is, and how shameful it is that they're going to let all the people involved with this murder absolutely off, not even going to fire General Kenneth McKenzie, who's in charge of CENTCOM. And if nobody made a mistake, which was what the report found, that nobody made a criminal mistake that led to the deaths, then it is the person in charge of the organization who set all this up. So, go Joe Biden, Mark Milley, Kamala Harris, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and then the head of CENTCOM, Kenneth McKenzie, all very responsible for allowing the murder of these people. It's just disgusting and unacceptable. Let's see. There is this interesting interview of the former Taliban finance minister on the number of ghost soldiers that the Afghan National Armed Forces had. And he actually estimates that it was, they inflated the number by 6 times to get the 300,000 strong army number. And that means that they only have 50,000 soldiers. He said that, the corruption was rampant in the government, and that, it wasn't as bad in his branch, of course, because, nobody's going to do an exclusive interview and admit a whole bunch of fault of their own. It wasn't bad where he was, but he says the corruption was really bad. Now, there's a couple interesting things here. That the Afghan army was this small explains a lot, right? How it fell so quickly. There's a hell of a lot less people that needed to surrender than the Biden administration was telling everybody. And even though I knew that there was a lot of ghost soldiers in the Afghan National Army, the fact that there's only only a sixth the amount of soldiers that they actually claim they had is shocking. Now, the other thing is this is a real problem for the Biden administration, because either they didn't know, and that has to be one of the biggest intelligence failures ever, to think that there's 300,000 people in an army that you are almost exclusively funding and there's only 50,000. Look, there's a little corruption around the edges, and there's 270,000 when there should be 300,000. That would be one thing. But we're talking about, for every one soldier that you actually are paying, you're paying for six. This is insanity. And that level of corruption that was going on, that the U.S. was paying for, was absolutely unacceptable. So either the Biden administration didn't know this, and again, huge intelligence failure, absolutely being swindled by just local Afghan commanders. You can't go out there, drive out there, send a helicopter out there and ask him where his men are. He's only got 3, you think he's got 25 or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, this should be very, very obvious to the extent of the problem. Or the Biden administration knew, pretended that it didn't, pretended they had a 300,000 man army, and this army was capable of holding back the Taliban, and then blamed everything on the Taliban, or excuse me, not on the Taliban, on the Afghan army for crumbling so quickly, when you knew you were just lying and they didn't have the army they did. So either way, this was really bad for at least the Biden administration, but really, the whole U.S. war effort in Afghanistan. Right now, the U.S. continues to brag about its withdrawal effort from Afghanistan, although they completely lost a baby. Still don't know where the baby went. Don't even know who stole it or anything, which, for the greatest logistical achievement in the world, seems awfully strange that you could completely lose a baby. But you also now have 1,300 Afghan children living in the U.S. Without their parents, and they really have no idea of when their parents are going to come or get here. And so this, again, it's one thing to evacuate a whole bunch of people from a country. It's another thing to actually do a good job of it. And so, they tout their number of, we brought 70,000 Afghans from Afghanistan to the U.S. Yay, didn't we do a good job? And no, you really didn't, because you separated a whole bunch of families and have no plans whatsoever on how to reunite them. Of course, I'm sure these children are, going through trauma, abandonment issues all the time, not being with their actual parents. And it has to be an absolute crisis. And they really don't seem to have a very good plan on how to fix all of this at this time. The U.S. did organize for 100 or so pilots who were members of the Afghan Army. They hopped in their planes or helicopters or whatever as the Afghan government was falling, and they were flying into Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And I think about 140 of them who made it into Tajikistan were actually held essentially as prisoners, and the U.S. has finally orchestrated them to fly at least to the UAE. They had chartered a flight between Tajikistan on the UAE. I'm not exactly sure, and I saw from some other reporting, it seems like their ultimate goal is to make it to the United States, and that is what the U.S. is planning on doing with these pilots. We have reports now that 300,000 Afghans have fled Afghanistan into Iran. Of course, these two countries share a very large border. Iran says they really don't have the ability to care for that many Afghans, and I believe I saw today that they're actually starting to export them. It doesn't seem like this is coming all in a single rush. As many as 4,000 or 5,000 Afghans are crossing every day into Iran, and so this is a slow trickle going over the border. It's unclear to me exactly who these Afghans are, if they are maybe Shia fleeing Afghanistan, particularly as the ISIS violence targets the Shia minority in the country, the Hazaras, or if this is just whoever happens to live in Afghanistan near the border with Iran, and they're fleeing over because that's the closest place to get the hell out of Afghanistan. And if it's the second one, it may not be as much that they're fleeing violence, but rather fleeing the abject poverty and humanitarian crisis that's currently impacting Afghanistan. I'm reading a lot of stories that aid groups are now feeling the squeeze, that they think they have a limited amount of time before winter comes and starts to like shut off passes to some of these towns and villages, makes it a lot more difficult, a lot more expensive to get in aid, especially without all the U.S. Military logistics in the country right now. And so we could be coming to a point where especially people in rural Afghanistan maybe, freezing to death or starving to death this winter, and there's not a whole lot anybody could do about it. So that could be the reason people are fleeing Afghanistan too. I think a lot of times the assumption is that they're fleeing the Taliban. That may not actually be the case. It could be the economic devastation that America caused in that country. All right, so let's talk about this fight between the Taliban and ISIS-K, or ISKP, whichever acronym people want to use at this time. There's this really good article that I really like in the American Conservative today called "Making Another ISIS," and it gets into and does a very good job of talking about the flow of some former members of the Afghan security forces, the Afghan National Army, the Afghan police, the Afghan border forces, the people in Afghanistan who are bad paid, funded, trained by the United States, now joining the Islamic State Khorasan province. It doesn't seem at this point that there's a ton of people going over. I have no idea if the number is in the scores, the hundreds, the thousands, maybe hundreds of former ISIS, former ANA members are joining up with ISIS-K. And in the article, he kind of talks about the first reason is just the money. That the only reason that these people ever worked for the U.S. government is it was a good paying job. And now if your training is being a soldier and you were formerly members of the Afghan National Army, which means you can't go and sign up with the Taliban now because you fought against them for the past 2 decades, your option is to go to the Islamic State Khorasan faction, which is actively engaged against the Taliban, and they'll probably pay you. And so it's just a job, right? Like that's especially in a situation, for anybody who's sitting there going, oh, what a bad excuse, how could you possibly join ISIS? I mean, if people are starving to death, or we have reports out of Afghanistan of people selling kids. I'm not exactly sure if I believe all of those, but let's just say your neighbor sells one of their kids. Well, I don't know, maybe joining ISIS isn't quite as terrible of a decision to make, or you can certainly understand maybe a parent's decision to join a militant group like ISKP over selling your daughter into sexual slavery. This is like the level of decision that we've created for the people of Afghanistan. And so that really awful thing between letting your family starve to death, becoming a militant, and selling your children. I don't know what you choose there. And that's just the horrible situation that we've created in Afghanistan. Now, for the other reason, he rolls back to Iraq. And I thought this was really interesting. I hadn't thought at this point. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Talking about how not brilliant in the sense of a good thing, brilliant in the sense of understanding the Middle East and how these things work. So when the U.S. took over Iraq and deposed Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi army still existed. And I think there were some like 500,000 people on the Iraqi army payroll. Now, the U.S. could have tried to build that army into the new government, or at least phased it out, but rather they just immediately got rid of it overnight, all these people unemployed, right? Essentially, you had the same thing happen in Afghanistan. Now, it did happen a little bit differently, but you do have similar dynamics where the Afghan government existed on, August 15th, and it didn't on August 16th. That's kind of the way it worked. And so then you had, 50,000 at least, soldiers who were out of a job. Some number of those soldiers want to continue being soldiers, and either because they hate the Taliban and now the ISKP is the best game in town for, joining up and killing the Taliban, or again, just because of the, monetary, the way it works, you need a job being a soldier. Well, now you essentially dissolved an army of 50,000 people, and all those people were looking for jobs where none existed. A lot of them end up going to ISKP. Now, I shouldn't say a lot. That's some of them, a number, and we'll hopefully understand the numbers of all this a little bit better later, go to ISKP. So, I think this is a really interesting, great article in the American Conservative. I think you'll definitely get a lot out of it if you decide to go and read it. One thing that makes me think that maybe there are a little bit more than has been reported so far joining ISKP is we have the Taliban, and this is a Taliban claim, and so they could be exaggerating or rounding up other people, but they say they've rounded up nearly 600 members of ISKP, and they've killed about 40, I think, since September or so. Again, some of these people could have escaped from prisons as the US-backed government fell, and then the Taliban rearrested them. And so maybe that's adding to the numbers, because I think people are very surprised to hear that, there were 600 IS members in Afghanistan to be arrested by the Taliban. I suppose it could also be a little bit of the denouements with the war in Syria, as some of the militants, I think, are looking to get out of Idlib, as the Syrian government and the Russians continue to bomb and push there. Maybe some Uyghurs trying to get back to China. There were thousands of them who had signed up to fight with the Islamic State, are now making their way back to Xinjiang, China, and they can do that by way of Afghanistan. So maybe there's people either rounded up in there that are being counted that maybe aren't actually members of ISKP, or they're just going from Syria to Afghanistan, taking up the fight in Afghanistan as the Syrian war continues to go in the wrong direction for the jihadists, although that is mainly at the hands of Assad and Russia. And then the possibility, too, that, maybe some of these people are former members of the ANA who went and joined up with ISKP and then got themselves captured. Now, ISIS continues to be a threat in Afghanistan. Just this morning, they planted some kind of mine outside of a mosque, and 15 people were injured. That was the latest report I had read, that, nobody had been killed. And I think that's all the news I have on Afghanistan today. I think the humanitarian crisis coming there may be pretty bad.